In this video, I'm going to cover a topic called content engineering. When you're creating content using AI tools like N8N workflows with multiple different tools and agents working together, one of the things that you're going to run into pretty quickly, which is going to really degrade the quality of your content and cause huge problems, is the context window bloating out. So one of the concepts is that now that we can do a lot more with tools like N8N, and I'll show you examples in this video in a moment, we can attach different things like an API call, we can fill the prompting window with multiple steps of prompts, and we can attach other tools to AI agents and to just normal in-chain agents to do a task for us. So if we're doing a content automation task where we're writing a blog post or we're getting social media content researched or deep research, video scripts, what can happen is now that we've got access to a whole lot of tools, we can do a lot more. But this then quickly runs into problems in that the context window, which is the window that the LLM has to process all this information, fills up really quickly. And then you can run into some serious problems. So you can get hallucinations, you can get timeout errors. So you'll notice when you get to this level that your N8N workflows might just sit timed out. And this can be because they're completely confused. It can't execute the workflow because you've overloaded it and confused the LLM, or you can hit a limit and tokens, and it will drop off information, and then you can get hallucinations and really bad outcomes. So if you want to get high quality content when you're using automations, you need to learn how to process large amounts of information, especially when you're doing deep research on a topic, because then the context window can blow out really quickly. So just as a quick definition of what the actual context window is, as you can see on the screen, a context window refers to the maximum amount of text or measured in tokens, which includes words, punctuation, and spaces that a large language model like GPT-4 can actually see and use in its responses. So it's the input that you're giving it, and it's also other inputs it gets from tools, and then it has to process all that and output it. So everything that you feed into the model, including the prompt, conversation, memory, and all of this can overload a prompt window, and then we can get degradation in the quality of our outcomes. So if you're doing content creation at scale, you really need to understand how to master context window management. So one of the ways that you can reduce just loading in huge amounts of documents when you're doing LLM stuff like this is you can break your content up or your research up and put it into chunks and store it in a Pinecone or another similar vector database. So you can take a large document, you can chunk it down, vectorize it, and then store it in a vector database to retrieve later. So that way you're not just pulling a whole full document that you might have scraped web pages and they might be really massive and you don't need the whole thing. You can break it down and store it and retrieve it later. Now this can help definitely, and it's something that I do a lot, but this alone is still not enough when you're doing large prompts, when you're trying to get complex things done with LLMs. So what I'm going to do now is go to N8N and show you some working examples of ways that I'm using at the moment to try and manage the context window and avoid getting degradation of the quality of the outcome that I'm getting. So I'm over at N8N. If you want to use N8N, there's a link below this video to build automations. What I'm going to show you first of all is a very basic example, then we're going to build out different ways that this context window can be managed. First of all, let's look at a common issue that people run into when they're building out automations for content creation. So let's just say you have a simple automation here. Now this could be part of a much more complex automation, but the principle will still apply. You have an input coming into an LLM. Now you can attach this to either ChatGPT or any other model that you're using. But the issue that I want to draw your attention to is the context window. So if we look at this example in here, this is a simple example. I just got ChatGPT to write a really complex prompt that would confuse an LLM. So as you can see here, prompt windows can get pretty long. Now this prompt could be significantly longer than this, and I've had ones that are a lot longer and ran into problems when I've tested them. I've had timeout errors, and then I've had it dropping information, hallucinations. So what you first got to understand is the basic principle before we deal with more complex things and solutions, which I'll get to later in this video. The first thing you need to do is not confuse the LLM with your prompting. So you don't want to have multiple things that it has, too many multiple tasks that it has to reason and do that are very complex on their own. You're much better to split those out into separate functions that you want a different LLM to do and break up your workflows. A lot of people, when they're learning how to do this, tend to just try and ram the context window with heaps of stuff, everything they can possibly think of. Like this example here, do 7,000 words on this, do another 8,000 or 5,000 lines on this, do work on this, and it's just confuses the LLM because you're pulling it in too many different ways and expecting way too much to come back out of it. So this is a ridiculous example of where you're going to cause confusion for an LLM. But not only that, this could be really long. And then if you've got other tools that you're attaching to the LLM, they're going to do research and pull it in, which I'm going to show you in just a second. And then what's going to happen is this context window is just going to blow out and get bigger and bigger and bigger. So what this means is not only the problems I've already mentioned, but it also means that the cost of producing that run is going to go up because your token usage is going to go up. Now there's ways to get around this, which I'm going to show you in this video. So let's just move on and say the first thing you need to do is make sure that you isolate your tasks and break them up into different tasks that you're asking the LLM to do, and not try and get it to do one LLM to do everything for you. That's kind of the basics. But if we move along and say, if we just take this trigger here and move along, let's just say we have an AI agent doing a task here. I'm just going to put a manual trigger in here just to test. Now this would be part of a bigger workflow, but one of the things you can do with agents, obviously, as you know, is to add tools on. So I can say, if I'm using a workflow and I want it to do research, I can get an agent, or it can be an inline LLM to do the same thing. But the reason I'm using an agent is you can add multiple tools onto an agent. And you'll probably notice in videos that you'll see people have these tools, and you might see they've got 12 tools attached to an agent that are allowing it to have access to a lot of different things that it can do. It might be updating Airtable, it might be doing deep research with Perplexity, which I'm going to show you in a second. It might be doing a whole lot of things. And that's great in that now we can get agents to do a lot for us, or when we're doing our research or writing or whatever it might be, we can do a lot more now with all access to all these tools. But that comes with a problem. It's like a double-edged sword. The more we do, the worse the result can come, because again, we're back to the problem of bloating out the content window. And I've experienced this a lot and had to really work at ways to fix this to get a much more quality outcome. Because if you're not careful, you can actually start to get really lower grade outcomes and not notice what's going on, thinking that you might get an output from the LLM, but you don't realize that it's hallucinated, or you don't realize it's dropped off a major section of your prompt because it's just overloaded and it's not actually actioning everything you think it is. So one of the ways that we can deal with this is, well, let's just look at an example. If we do an example here and we get this agent here to use a tool called Perplexity, I've attached Perplexity on here. So what it's going to do there, if I just start the workflow in here, it's going to do it's going to get the prompt that it gets from upstream in the workflow, and it's going to call the Perplexity tool now. So what's going to happen is I've got my prompt inside here already, but now the Perplexity tool is going to go and do research, pull that research back, and that's going to end up in the prompt window as well. So now this is fine when it's a small execution. Now I've used in this model here a simple Sonar Pro, but if you're doing Sonar Deep Research, your prompt window is going to be a lot larger than this. So you can see on the right-hand side, this is what's come back from Perplexity. This is reasonably manageable as far as the amount of information. But if I'd used a deep reasoning model here, this would be significantly larger. Now, if you think about this, if you've already got a really large prompt with other inputs from upstream in your automation, you might be feeding in other inputs in here. I've just used a basic trigger here, but you've got to remember, these are used often in line with other things in an automation. So you might have a lot more information coming from in here. You've now got information coming from in here, and you'll have information inside your prompt window already. Now, this is just a basic one for this video, but this might be already quite complicated in itself. So now you've got all these inputs filling up the prompt window. And the problem is that over time, we can reach limits and have degradation, which I talked about. So if you look in here in the chat module, in the ChatGPT module here, if you go to the logs tab here, you can see what's going on here. You can see the flow of information coming through. So all of this is going to end up in this final prompt window. So you can see this is showing all the information in this particular run that's getting fed through. So again, you've got your own prompt, other inputs, and the tool now pulling information back. And this works perfectly fine when it's quite simple like this. But when you start getting too complicated because you start getting access to different tools and learning different ways that you can use these agents, this can get pretty crazy and start to ruin the quality of the output of your content. So there's a couple of things that you can do to fix this. One thing that you can do is break up the prompt and just split them across, like I mentioned earlier. That's a pretty simple thing to do. Other things that you can do is use a vector database. So I mentioned you can store information and just retrieve what you want out of that when you need it. So you query the database and pull back what you want. That's how you can use Pinecone and other databases, which I've looked at in previous videos. So another way you can do it is just, instead of loading this up, let's say you had about 5 of these different tools doing different things. You might have one doing a live search or a data for SEO feed or some other functions. Imagine if you've got 5 of these, instead of just attaching them all as tools and then bringing all that data back into the LLM and dumping it on it and saying, deal with this, process this, you're not likely to get a great result when you start overloading like that. So one way to get around that is to, instead of having a tool, is to execute it as a separate workflow. So if I take this off here and we move down for this example, whoops, let me just jump back out of that. If we move down in this example, it's the same LLM, but you can see now the difference is, let's say I still had my Perplexity tool. If I wanted to do another tool like SERP API, which will go and do a live Google search and get some live information, I might want to do that as part of my research and the automation. Instead of just attaching it as another tool and then getting it to bring the information back, I can separate it as a second workflow and get another LLM to deal with it in its own context window. So now I'm separating out the content and different LLMs into their own context window and only bringing back what I need to into this LLM instead of just overloading it with everything all at once. So the way we do this is it's exactly the same setup before. You have your LLM. I've got a tool attached, which is Perplexity. I've got the model that I've used. And in here, I'm just adding on a workflow. So it's a Call N8N workflow tool. So this is a tool that you can attach. If you go to the side toolbar, if I just click another tool, you can see there Call N8N workflow tool. You can click that, and if you open this up inside here, from the workflow, if you've got other subflows already set up, you can choose them from here. So the way that this works is, if I go and have a look at an example workflow that I would set up, let's say I wanted to do a simple workflow over here, and I'm going to use an agent over here that has this SERP API tool attached. So it's really exactly the same thing. I've just split out the functions as a simple example. But over here, I'm using the tool called SERP API, and I'm asking the LLM to then do live research using this tool. Now I can say to it in the prompt, when you get this research back, I want you to process it and just extract what I need and send that back, and the work as your output, which will come back to the first workflow. So the way you do that is you have the trigger set up when executed by a sub workflow. So that's the trigger that you set up. So if you look over on the right, you have executed by sub workflow here. So this is a trigger here, executed by sub workflow. What this allows us to do here is we can enter in the fields we want to pull from the other workflow. So the way you do that is you set up the fields that you want to come in, that you need. So in this example, I've put niche idea, and I've just put it as a string. So what I'm saying is I want the niche idea as a text string. In this example, I just hard-coded liposomal vitamin C benefits just to show you an example. I've pinned that, but this would come in dynamically. So the way you pin data when you want to just do testing like this is you just click edit. You can just overwrite the dynamic field and type in what you want and click save, and that'll save that text in there for you to do testing on. So if I get out of there now, that's pinned that. But what would normally happen is, once I've set up that field, if I go back to the original agent, you can see down below workflow inputs would show up, and then that niche idea field is in here. So what I can do is, instead of hard coding it like that, what I would do is I would just set that to let the agent fill that in. So when you're prompting from this agent here, you're telling this agent, when you're calling this sub workflow, you need to give it the niche idea, which in this case was liposomal vitamin C, but it depends on what you're actually doing, obviously. It's then going to call this workflow, send in the information to the second workflow that it needs. The second workflow receives it, and it will action it inside this LLM and inside this tool. Now, this is a very simple example. It's not needed when you've only got 2 tools and a very simple research prompt like this. But you've got to imagine if you're doing more complicated things, just stacking and stacking and stacking more tools and filling up that prompt window is not a good idea. Trust me, I've tried it and had many problems until I, find ways to get around it. And this is the best ways to do it, is to break things out into sub workflows. Or into smaller actual prompts like I mentioned in the beginning. So what's happening now is once the first one runs, it runs the second workflow. This workflow will execute like this, which we can just do a quick test because it's actually got pinned data. It's going to call the SERP API, do its task, and then it will send that back through the sub workflow. So now what we look at, if we look inside here, you can see in the logs here, the information is quite simple. This was just a really simple example again, but imagine if it was a lot more complicated. You can see this would have ended up in the original LLM's context window, and then you'll have multiple tools. You can see how quickly it can really start to get out of control. And this is only going to become more and more of a problem because more and more tools are becoming available for us to use in these N8N workflows, and it gets pretty complicated, trust me. I've run into a lot of problems with hitting limits on context windows, with getting degradation. It's become a real issue, and you can't ignore it if you want to create high-quality content, especially if the content is longer form. You got to imagine if you're doing a blog post, you might be if you're trying to pass the entire blog post, and it's a long one, to another agent, immediately that blog post is your input. It's already massive. Now, if you're going to get it to do something with that, it's just going to get bigger and bigger. So there's other ways to deal with that, which I'll talk about in a moment. But this is a quick example here on what we can do to deal with sub workflows. So there's other ways that you can reduce the amount of bloat in the context window. So you can actually split things up and iterate. So instead of just feeding the entire thing into an LM, you might use a loop over items and iterate and split and only send one chunk in at a time for it to process. That's one way to handle it, because if, like I said before, your input, which might be an entire blog post, is really large, you're immediately hitting your context window limit. You can't really do a lot more and expect a lot of outcome. You will notice that it will just sit and spin its wheels trying to actually execute this, or it will time out. And even if it does execute it, you really run the risk of the quality dropping off, or it only doing some of the things that you've asked it to do. And you can test this out. There's some ways to try and force an LLM to do everything. One of the ways that you can do it is adding a tool called Think. So you can add a Think module onto your agent here, and the Think module is going to force it to actually answer questions that you give it and say, before you output, use the Think tool and answer these questions. Did you do this? Did you do this? Did you do this? Did you do this? The problem with this, it does work, but if you start to get to maximum lengths on your context window, it's not even going to answer all the questions that you give it. Believe me, I've tried. So you can have it in here, in the actual context here, you can say, after you've given it all the prompt and all the information, you can say, now, before you output your output, that was a mouthful, you need to use the tool attached called Think and answer these questions. Did you do this? And you can give it a series of questions. The problem is, like I said, it doesn't always answer all those questions, even if you try and force it to. So you might have 10 questions that it has to answer to successfully say it executed everything you asked it. But if you check the logs, what often happens when you get to the maximum lengths, it'll answer 3 of them and ignore the other 6. Or sometimes it won't even use the tool at all, the Think tool at all. It just bypasses it and doesn't even answer it. So yes, the Think tool can help you can make sure you put guardrails around the LLM to do what you want. But again, if you max it out, it's not going to use even that. So you have to learn to control the context window to keep the quality high. So other ways that you can do this is to limit the size of that input. So if you're scraping a web page, for example, and you're telling the LLM, read this web page and summarize it for my research, if you're doing research on social media posts, or anything where you've got an input where you've scraped information. So you might be using websites that can do that, like Data for SEO will do stuff like that, or Firecrawl is a good one. It will go and scrape APIs from Appify. There's a lot of tools now that will go out and scrape and get information. But again, dumping all of that into a context window, it can be a real risk. So you may want to filter some of that information out first, or strip some of the HTML out of the web page so you don't feed it the HTML as well. That's useless. So you can convert things to Markdown. So you can go from an HTML to Markdown and clean it. So now you've stripped out a lot of the characters. So that's a simple way to do it. Or you may process it first and only pass through what you need into the context window. You may not need the whole web page. You could summarize it, send a summary in to this LLM, which is all it needs to be able to execute its task, rather than ramming the entire thing into it. So by managing the context window, you really are going to increase the quality of the output and also the speed that it's going to be able to output as well. So I hope you found this video useful. If you're doing content creation with AI and these automation tools, you really need to pay attention to this, especially when you get more complicated in what you're doing. I hope you found it helpful. If you did, leave me a comment below, hit subscribe and like, and I'll see you in the next video.